Hi all, and welcome to this Smash live stream event. My name's Dave Swney. I'm a Waikato dairy farmer and Smash committee member here in the Waikato. So with me today, I've got Anna Bennett. Anna will come to you shortly, and I'll introduce you and in your role. But firstly, as always, I just want to recognise the sponsors and support we've got with Smash. So you'll see those there up there on your screen. We've got Dairy NZ, Balance, Barron Brugg, LIC, Pioneer, BNZ, FMG, and MPI. So a big thanks to these sponsors and thank you for your support. So Anna, really good to have you along today. Now you're a director and partner there at Cooper Aiken in Matamata. Funnily enough, we've had a bit of a history of working together on these sort of topics. A few years ago, I remember when I was at Dairy NZ, I managed to twist your arm to get you involved in some business growth events that I was running over there in Matamata. Scarily, it's probably 13, 14 years ago now. So
yeah, time flies, eh?
time flies. So you're obviously passionate about accountancy and helping farmers in the industry. How long have you sort of been working in that space for?
Pretty much, nearly 20 years now. So we're predominantly an agri firm, and we do some non-agri, but usually it's services to agri and mainly dairy farmers. So it's but as you say, time flies, and about 20 years now, and been based in Matamata for a good 15 years.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Oh no, that's cool. And now, look, as people are aware, today with this session, it's about pathways to farm ownership, and sort of about the changes and challenges we've seen in the industry over the years. Anna's going to dive into some more of the detail around some of the key financial indicators to maybe focus on when on the pathway to farm ownership. Look at borrowing sources that are out there available, and finish with a couple of case studies that we can sort of talk to, and if there's any questions, just fire them at us. There's a space there that if you ask a question, they'll come through to us, and we'll try and make sure we can cover those off. But to frame it all up, look, I mean, the question's always been who's going to sort of buy our dairy farms. It's always been a hot topic, I guess, and we've got a bit of an aging demographic of farm owners out there. Farm ownership has always been tough, but it seems like it has just got that little bit harder for this next generation coming through. Smash ran a project because of these headwinds, I guess, facing the industry. We ran a project to try and identify, how are farmers actually successfully buying farms at the moment and coming through the industry. What are some of the key characteristics of these farmers? What are some of the lessons they've learned along the way, and how can we help progression within the industry? So Smash set out, we secured some funding from MPI and Dairy NZ to carry out this work, and I'll share some of those findings with you in a minute. But a report was created and produced, and we won't go into all the detail of that report, but you'll be able to find that on our Smash website at smallerherds.co.nz. There's some really good reading in there, and I guess some sort of home truths about sort of those challenges that we are sort of facing out there. In terms of those challenges, as I said, we've got an aging demographic of farmers. We're starting to see sort of a lower number of herd owning share milkers, share milking contracts available, and that's come about by people sort of holding on to some of those jobs for a bit longer, and also just a reduction in some of those contracts being available. There's such a high level of investment required, as we all know, and that's always been a challenge. So how do we actually grow our equity to get ourselves into a position to get into farm ownership. And we've seen quite a shift in capital gain as well over the years. So we're not quite seeing the capital gains that we maybe saw sort of 10 to 20 years ago. So from the survey that Smash sort of carried out, I guess the project started in July. We interviewed around 12 rural professionals, mainly accountants and bank managers, and sat down with a few working groups of farmers to try and frame up a survey that we could put out to the industry. And we ended up getting around 300 responses, and those responses were from farmers that were either pursuing farm ownership, farm owners themselves, or already in the industry. So as you can see up there, we had, in terms of from the responses, we had 13% that were not pursuing farm ownership, that were farmers in the industry. We had 40% on the pathway, and 46% of those respondents are already farm owners. So interesting enough that those farmers not pursuing farm ownership, I guess some of those key things that we've already discussed around, slow equity growth, poor returns and price of land are some of the key reasons why they weren't pursuing that farm ownership goal, which sort of fits with what we sort of found with the survey. Now, for those farmers that are already on the pathway and trying to achieve the goal of farm ownership, I guess as you can see in the table there, some of the mechanisms of growing equity and trying to get to that end goal haven't really changed. Like, there's nothing new up there. Farmers have always had to sort of, have tight cost control. There's always been an emphasis on, rearing stock and good quality stock and maybe leveraging off that. However, there's been a little bit of a shift, I guess, in terms of the weighting on some of these other mechanisms to try and grow that equity instead of, just that the typical sort of share milking and contract milking and standalone sort of mechanisms. And we can sort of see that in this next slide here, the differences that we're sort of seeing, and that's come out of the report, the old versus new. So again, nothing's new, but the weighting there, where farmers are having to take on a lot more responsibilities nowadays to try and really grow their equity at a rate that allows them to get to the end goal of farm ownership. You can see there, the other off-farm income is, we've seen, nearly a doubling, or we have seen a doubling there, based on these stats of how important that is to building that equity. So, this sort of frames up, I guess, the scope and what we're dealing with within the industry. And I guess, that it's always been hard to get to that end goal, but things have changed a little bit over the years, which is sort of maybe slowing the rate down a little bit. So Emma, look, I've sort of been talking for long enough, but and hopefully I've sort of framed things up a little bit to sort of lead into some of your stuff and what you're seeing within your own practice and out there in the field. There are some challenges, but I guess it's not all doom and gloom too. There are some opportunities, and we've seen within the work that Smash have done that those current farm owners, there is a percentage of them that are still looking outside the box and trying to help that next generation come through. So as we go through these next few slides, we'll try and sort of flesh out some of those real life examples and pick your brains on some of the key things that we need to be looking at, really.
Cool. Okay. No, so I was asked to present about key financial measures for people buying building equity and looking for farm ownership, but also these all count for the other side too, people who are already farm owners. What did I think was some key financial measures? And probably the main message is profit, not production. And any business has to have a good economic viability. And so profit is really what falls out the bottom once you've paid everyone. And there's, when we look in 2024, with an $8.56 payout, we do some stats, and we found that farm owners' profit before interest and drawings was about $520,000 or $4.20 a milk solid, and 50-50 share milkers, the average was about $174,000 or $1.45 a milk solid. That's before interest and drawings, so that's purely income, dairy, livestock, less all your expenses other than paying the bank and paying yourself. And so, you just really got to focus on knowing your own numbers and what falls out the bottom, because what falls out the bottom is your opportunity to repay debt or have debt or buy assets or any other lifestyle or business choices that you want to have. And so making sure you understand what those are is really the main message there.
Yeah. And so just with some of that, some of those indices there, and for a farmer trying to sit down and work out what those financial measures look like for them, have you got some comments around that? Like what other support can they get to sort of just try and get the ball rolling there in that space?
Yeah, like I know Dairy NZ has a lot of good resources around, like, do you mean what types of income or how to work out your profit, Dave? Like, yeah. So, if you're obviously your accountant or Figured or Dairy NZ, or just saying, well, what's all the money that comes into our business, and then what's all the money that goes out? And so, income streams can be a range of things. The traditional one's dairy and milk, but it can also be rental of commercial buildings or homes on the farm. It can be off-farm income. It could be a KiwiSaver or similar type of investment. So what comes in and then what goes out in terms of your normal operating costs. And one point there is there's probably not, we often get asked which farming system is most profitable. And it's not really one beats all. It's every business is unique, and it will come down to that second point, probably around the operator and the personal factor, sometimes which will drive the profit.
Yeah. Okay, and that's the next slide we'll come to now. In terms of that personal factor there.
Yeah. So, I was talking to a banker recently with some 50-50 share milkers who are looking to buy their first farm. And it was interesting, the bank manager quote said, we're happy to push the boat out for these people and do principle based on their long-term goals and aspirations. And that came down to that personal factor. And they had proven over the last 5 years their ability to repay debt, their ability to cope with stresses of a low payout, high interest rates during that time, staff and being able to have good staff, and that work-life balance, and that personal factor and having that relationship with your banker can or will make finance a lot easier if you use a bank, like most people do, to buy their first property.
Yeah, okay. And I guess, like we've talked about that personal factor, and like I said earlier, people are having to sort of take on more roles and that sort of thing, which I guess, your rural bank manager sees, and some of these support partners can see you trying really hard. Is there also like a negative side of that as well from the, I guess the personal factor point of view that people need to be aware of as well?
Yeah, I think so. Like, the banks, do you mean like if you display some characteristics that aren't so good, or?
Yeah, like I guess for us coming through, we are so hungry to try and progress quickly, and sometimes there's zero risk we can take on too much, which, the third point up there with the health and well-being space, is it actually achievable, or are we just sort of biting off a bit too much?
I think it is achievable, but you might just have to step it out. And I think if you're feeling overwhelmed, actually sitting back and looking at your numbers and understanding where the gap is really important. Because if you have some light at the end of the tunnel and hey, look, we might need a contract milk for 2 or 3 seasons, then we should be in a position to have a deposit for a herd, and then and just sort of pace it out. Because often people don't understand what the gaps are that they have to try and work towards to get there. And along the way, you've got to obviously look after yourself. And if things get a bit wobbly now and then, that's okay. It's just a reset. And hey, here's what our updated plan is, and this is what we're going to do.
Yeah. And I guess with the report also highlighted that some of the farm owners commented on, getting involved in some of the extra stuff outside the farm gate, like dairy industry awards and that sort of thing, which I know you've been involved with a lot of industry stuff from Cooper Aiken's point of view. How do you see that bow sort of tying in well for farmers coming through in terms of reputation and that sort of thing?
Yeah, reputation's huge, yeah. And the bankers all know, and I guess if you enter the dairy industry awards or you take place in discussion groups, you're out there, you're talking to people. I mean, hopefully it helps your business. You pick up 1 or 2 things that helps drive your profit or things you hadn't thought about. But also that reputation and being involved in the industry will go a long way, because the bankers and professional peers do take note. And there can be some, obviously, if you're a prize winner, but also the alumni opportunity at the moment with ASB and the Dairy Industry Awards, that there can be some actual true benefits there as well. So I definitely recommend, and even just for your own growth and progression, if you only stick to what you never learn anything. And so you've really it's a great way to socialise and get to know new skills.
Yeah, and sort of push yourself in a space that you're not so comfortable in. Yeah. And I go, we're part of the Dairy Industry Awards, been on the committee for many years, and so we go to some of those events, the quiz nights and the bits and pieces, and turning up you might feel really nervous, but most people at the end are people happy, people smiling, they've learnt something, or they've met a new person and got a free feed, and it's good. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, no, that's good. And look, so if I'm a farmer and I've figured out what I want to do and how I'm going to do it, or sort of needing a little bit of help, obviously, with the how, in terms of sort of obtaining finance and sort of getting stuck into that space, have you got some tips there?
Yeah, I definitely start with where you're at now. So understanding what your equity is at the moment. So, and then also understanding what your profit is at the moment, and then what cash is available. Because that's a great starting point to then map out how to move forward. And so on that next slide, Dave, we just talk a bit about equity. So what is equity? Equity is just your assets less your liabilities. So livestock, cash, KiwiSaver, and take off what you owe to the bank or credit cards. What's the difference down the bottom? And that will help determine what the deposit is that you have to put towards your purchase if you're looking at buying a herd or buying property. It doesn't have to be cash deposit. It's just your net assets is often what's available. Equity position. So we'll go through an example in a minute, but when you're buying an asset, just like if you're buying a rental property or a herd, there is some of that asset that's used as an equity deposit. So up there we've got 35 to 40%. And what that's meaning is if you buy a farm, you'll need to come up with 35 to 40% of equity from assets outside of what you're buying for a farm. But the farm itself, you can say, well, if a farm's $5 million, you don't need to have $5 million. you can have 35% of that. And the interest cover, the banks want to make sure that as interest rates rise and fall, you've got enough profit to cover a rise in interest rates. And interesting around the just that debt service ratio, in the past the banks have been quite hot on paying debt off over 20 years. This young couple I was talking to their bank recently about, they said, look, we're actually flexible in principle for these guys, depending on what their long-term strategy and goals are. And so that's actually changed in the last 12 months. So nice to know it can be over 20 years, but doesn't actually sound like it needs to be, depending on what the goals are for the business.
Yeah, I guess that's a good example, having those conversations with the bank manager and knowing what you want out of this next step is just so important, because it's just going to be so different for every individual, isn't it, in their own sort of circumstances.
Yeah, and every property you look at, like there's an example recently of farmers looking at $4 million farm, and when we went to the agent about it, the agent said, well, actually there's 4 titles here, and the vendors are quite happy to keep the main title with the house on it and another section. So that brought the purchase price down to just over 3. And they're going to make the same amount of money because they didn't want a worker and they're happy to live in the cottage on the farm. So every you've got to dig it. Like if you see, hey, this is a property I'm actually interested in, you've really got to dig into the detail around it to understand the actual price of it. Yeah,
and I guess so. What you're saying as well is if there's one, a scenario comes up you're really interested in, but it doesn't quite work on paper with your numbers, look outside the box a little bit and ask the question, because there might be other ways that you can sort of skin the cat, so to speak, to make it work.
Yep, definitely. Yep. Yeah. And so I've just got a quick example here in terms of equity or viability. This was just to say, so when the banks look at your ability to borrow, they have status quo figures that they use, and they're using that to say, hey, look, we know payout goes up and down, we know interest goes up and down. We want to check that what the equity is and what the ability to repay is based on the, as a stretch, like they would have a house. So this just shows here an example of if you're buying a farm with 120,000 milk solids with an $8 payout, because that's sort of what we've seen the banks. That might be increasing slightly with the banks now, but traditionally that's what it's been. Livestock at 56 cents and expenses at $5.27. We can see there that the cash profit's sitting about $3.74. For your drawings, banks will look at what you have spent in drawings. So be aware of that, and just make sure your drawings are clean. So sometimes you'll have things in there like transfers to private accounts or portfolios or other things. Doesn't mean you've spent the money, but it means you need to be able to illustrate why your actual true drawings going forward, if you bought this property, would be 80,000. Generally just work it out at 25%. It might swing slightly higher depending on when profit goes up, but that's a good starting point. And so then that gives us, this will tell us, hey, if we bought this farm, we should have about 200,000 available for debt servicing. And so that's without taking into account any off-farm income or other revenue. We've got no rental income in there. There might be other types of income, but on the face of it, if we bought this farm, we should have about 200,000 to service debt.
Yeah, and I guess it's a stress-tested scenario too, isn't it? We've got to be realistic with that milk price and interest rates and that sort of thing as well, and make sure there's tax in there and all those things that we don't want to have sort of as a surprise going forward.
Yeah. And then the second part, so that's step one, to say if we bought this farm, how much would it generate in cash to repay debt? And then step 2 is how much equity do we have to go to the bank to borrow the money. And so this example is just saying if a farm was $5 million, the lending on that, you could get about 3.6 million, take into account your current livestock and if you have 100 grand cash deposit. So this is like a share milker looking to buy their first farm potentially. But if the farm costs 5 million and you can raise 3.6 off your existing assets and the new farm, there is a difference there of 1.3. And so that's where we need to start digging into where can we generate that difference from? Can we, is there any off-farm assets? Is there a property we're looking at, is there a title we could sell? Is there a family loan or a guarantee that we could look into? Or is the bank willing to push the boat, as they've said recently, and maybe, push that borrowing percentage up a bit more, as long as you're committed to paying off debt and finding other income?
Yeah. I guess it's trying to get a starting point, isn't it? How far off the mark are we? And as we discussed earlier, there's often a lot of other things going on in the background. So how can we maybe leverage off the things we're already doing, or what other opportunities are there to maybe close that gap? Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's where people go, I didn't know if I could buy a farm or not, or I don't know how far away from it I am. So if you start looking at a few farms and getting an understanding for what they're generating in terms of profit and what your equity position is, because often what happens we do see too is people, when you calculate equity, well, sometimes 50-50 share milkers will be going from larger jobs down to farm ownership, possibly less cow numbers. So you might even have some cows there to sell that could help generate, bridge the equity gap as well. And we all know, cow values are pretty good at the moment. So just looking how that all pans out as well.
Yeah. And I guess we took what we're presenting today. We basically did a roadshow with a series of events around New Zealand with Smash, and we had farmer panelists sort of talk about how they've achieved farm ownership. And when I attended here in the Waikato, we had the Whitakers, and they were talking about how they got to farm ownership on a smaller farm where they are now. But it was a classic example of what you just talked about, Anna. They were actually looking for a larger share milking job, and then this a little farm came up, and they didn't necessarily think they were in a position to own a farm and to get there, and then with doing the sums and getting the bank manager around them and the accountant, they actually figured out, well, actually this could be achievable, and so they've downsized in terms of herd number, I guess, and farm size, but they've reached that goal of farm ownership, and I guess it's a bit of a stepping stone for them in that sort of farm ownership career. So I guess you sort of don't know until you start doing the sums and having the conversations.
Yeah, and you can do it really high level. You guys know approximately that costs this much, what the expense side of life will be, in milk and income. Just if you use that $8 and use maybe 60 cents a kg and profit from livestock as a starting point, do the numbers. And it's interesting, that topic there too, Dave. Like, I had a share milker recently looking to buy a farm. They make really good profits at the moment from their share milking job. And we had the conversation around, well, you could continue doing what you're doing, put it aside. In 10 years, you might have $1.5 to $2 million in the bank if you didn't do much other than invest it. Or you could pay off, nearly a whole farm in that time, a smaller farm, and then have to do the work themselves and no employees and bits and pieces. But that meant so much more to them than putting the money in the bank. That would give them fulfillment and what they're looking for in their lives. So that's what they chose to do.
Yeah, cool. So finance options out there?
Yes. Yeah, so obviously from the Smash, you found most people do use banks, and sometimes if you can't borrow from a bank, it might be in conjunction with someone else, or it might be some of these other things. So we do see equity partnerships. Obviously, sometimes one party has cash to invest, one party borrows, or you both borrow from separate assets and bring it to the new business. Vendor finance is becoming more common, I think particularly with herds, so share milkers buying first lot of cows. Guarantors, so if you do have family or someone who's willing to be a guarantor for you, and we always recommend just a set amount for a set time to protect the guarantor, but that can often be a great way for families to help their children without selling an asset, but leveraging off the asset.
Yeah.
And just a note there, it's often easier if everyone's dealing with the same bank, but it's not a has to be, it's just easier.
Yeah, I guess because the bank has security over assets and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah. Tier 2 lenders are an option. We don't see it much for farm ownership, but sometimes for livestock or plant machinery. And the interest rates are usually around 3 to 5% higher than a traditional bank.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will go down that avenue to get them across the line and then look to refinance down the track, or it may work well. We've had an overseas investor that asked us to help facilitate or put people in touch because they wanted to invest in New Zealand, and they were a New Zealander living overseas. And then obviously family loans are sometimes all or part of the lending. And it's just really important there that if you do go down family lending, that you get a good loan document drawn up. I'm always asked, should we pay the solicitor or not? Yes, pay the solicitor, do it properly, make sure everyone understands, is it principal, is it interest? You can really structure the loan however best meets the needs of the family or the parents in particular. And we do see that often being used. The banks will be interested or need to know too, is there interest, is there not interest? And if there is interest or principal, they will treat it as a liability when they look at your equity. So sometimes we see what's called a deed of subordination or a subordination agreement where the family says, hey, look, of the $3 million, only $500,000 is interest bearing. The rest is, I'm happy that it's still a loan, but I'll rank behind the bank in terms of debt to get things across the line.
Yeah, okay. We've had a couple of questions come up too, Anna, just while we've been talking about some of these things. So firstly, I mean, we've got equity partnerships up there. Claire's asked a question there about, where's the best place for people to find, other people willing to get into equity partnerships and options for lease to buy and that sort of thing. Have you got any top tips in that space or heard of any sort of successful stories?
Yeah, I think it's really leveraging off your network. So if you're wanting something like that, I would be talking to your bank, talking to your accountant, talking to your farm advisor, farm owner, discussion groups. Like, you just never know. The more people you talk to, the more people might say, look, I'm interested in doing something here. The equity partnerships I've seen, generally the people know each other through some way. I don't think I've dealt with any that have been complete strangers. So they've been, they've worked together on farms. They know each other from, family, like early days. They're farm owner workers. There's some connection there. But I would definitely tell as many people, good people, that you think, hey, we could do something here, and you never know what might pop up.
Yeah, and I know it's come up with this roadshow as well. There's a new business out called Landify, and it's a company trying to connect farmers and sort of people that are, one, looking for opportunities, but two, wanting to help people with opportunities in the agricultural sector. So if you Google Landify, you'll see their business there, and I think you can register for a small fee and put a bit of a proposal forward, and then people can actually get in contact with you if they've got something to offer. So, there are some cool things sort of coming out to help sort of make that networking thing a little bit easier. There's another question here too, Anna, which probably fits in with our next slide about building equity. We've got a question here. What are people looking at their first farm? What are they looking at typically? So is it hectares, cow numbers, ability to grow its capital, or milk solids produced? And I guess that sort of, fits in with sort of the building equity type conversation.
Yeah, like, do you mean what are people looking for, like what types of farms, or?
The question here from Thomas is what are people looking at for their first farm? Is it sort of looking at hectares or cow numbers, or is it just solely based on production?
I think it's probably a mixture of all of the above. Like they're looking at farms. Often I'll have people say, look, so there's probably a mix. Do I want employees or not? Sometimes people come out of the big share milking jobs and be like, we don't mind having a couple of employees, or we don't want any employees, or, so that will drive it a bit. But often the price is based on hectares too. So people buying farms can only, if they're first farm buyers, can usually only afford so many hectares. And so depending on what milk production it produces and at what price. So, generally smaller farms would be first farm buyers. But in saying that, if they've got some help with equity or got something there, as long as it stacks up the financial viability, they might say, well, actually, we do want to work here because we do want the option of having time off or not working on it only ourselves. So I think people are looking for economic viability for farms, and then they'll buy them. But if they don't stack up economically, they won't be able to.
Yeah, and that comes back to your first point, isn't it? Like any farm system can work. It all depends what drops out the bottom, regardless of the milk solids and the size of the farm, how much profit is actually being generated out of this business. Yeah. So when we're looking at building equity, to try and get to that goal of farm ownership, with this, we've got the slide up here about, we've talked about goals and that sort of thing for farmers. What are some of the key points there?
Yeah, I think it's just knowing what your why is, knowing what, the return on an asset, the return on investment on farms has been quite, can be 2 or 3%. So if your why is to make as much money as you can to retire at 50, you probably want to share milk and then sell at that point. If your goal is I'd really like to feel settled in my own farm, that I can make better and one day reap the reward of that, then farm ownership's a good goal. So it's just understanding your why and making sure your partner is on board with your why as well. And if you have different whys, for example, farm ownership location might become quite important. If one of you wants to grow your career off farm and wants to grow it on, location can come into play there a bit. And I guess just to sort of sum that up as well, in terms of the building equity, again, with those farmer panelists we had as part of the roadshow, the 3 farmers we had at the one I attended, all completely different ways of building their equity. We had, like I said, the Whitakers, who did it sort of, with a bit of property investment coming into the mix. We had Michael and Lindy Bennett, who did everything under the sun, from, leasing some land to rearing more stock, taking on multiple jobs. And we also had the Gillies, who own a hire business in town. So, there's so many different ways that people can look at and growing that equity going forward. Yeah. So I've just got a few examples here of real life examples of what we've seen people do. So this was a couple who came into farm ownership farming a bit later. So they had a career change in their early 30s. They had already purchased their own home, which had a mortgage on it. But they had come from farming as children and wanted to return to that career. And so I guess the main lesson of this one is that farm ownership was never their goal. They said, we want to get out of this by mid-50s. We'll go in at 30, come out at 50. So they had to do a few years as employees, managing, working up to contract milking. Jill always worked off farm and Jack worked on farm. And then their goal was to buy their herd, which they did. They always had, during that time, their own home that they rented out. And then during that time, they actually also purchased 2 to 3 more investment properties. So that was where they were funneling their excess cash that they were making, was to buy these properties, because they said, well, by 55, we want passive income of 3 houses and our own home debt free. And Jill will probably continue to work on wages. And Jack, they've actually just sold their herd and he's currently just looking at some other opportunities because he still wants to be self-employed, but he might go on, he's looking at other businesses to run or do at the moment. Yeah. And that's fine. That was their goal, and it's worked really well for them.
Yeah. And look, we've got a couple more that we'll just flick through quickly of different structures that are out there. And look, we're not sort of presenting these as this is the right fit for people, but I guess this is an example, Anna, of what people can sort of ask the question about, and there's just so many ways of doing it.
Yeah. So this was just Tom and Jerry. So Tom share milked for Jerry. Was a contract milker for Jerry and asked to become his 50-50 share milker. He didn't have the equity to purchase a herd, and at that time the bank was not willing to lend to him. And so between Tom and Jerry, they did a loan over 5 years, principal and interest from the beginning. They're not related. Tom wanted a couple of things. The farm owner said, well, I want principal from the beginning. I want market interest rate or slightly better. I want to know you'll be here for 5 years, which was important to him. And if Jerry wanted to leave early, Tom got first right to purchase the herd back. And so that was non-family that worked and gave Jerry an opportunity earlier than he thought he could do it. But he just had the conversation with the farm owner.
Yeah, cool.
Cool. This is a more complicated sort of slide, but the main thing that we've got going on here is this was family. This was a family succession. And the main lesson was parents had hardly no debt, that they owned a farm, and they had off-farm kids and on-farm kid. And on-farm kids said, well, I'd like to buy the farm. And the parents said, that's cool. You give us 80% of the cash and we'll give you a loan for 20%. That's interest-free on demand. And then we can give your other 2 siblings a similar amount for the same and give us the opportunity to take money out and do what we want to do. And the main thing that's come out of this over the last 15 years is that the son purchased the farm. He created titles on that farm. He then sold those titles, purchased a second property with some tourism off non-farming income as well as farming. And he's just purchased a South Island farm. So mum and dad aren't owners with him in the business. They acted like a bank to enable it to happen. Yeah. And so succession's like we could do another 5 hours on succession, but the point is it can be done and it has been done. We just got to run through it.
Yeah. And I think that's probably, our time's sort of run out, Anna, but it's such a good spot to finish on because, farm ownership is still possible. It's always been hard. That hasn't changed. And I think it's important we don't resent the older generation of farmers, because they had their own challenges. We've just got different challenges, as you know, for this next generation coming through. And it's, you know, I think it's just so important to have those conversations with your bank managers, your accountants, your farm owners, and wider network to try and seek out those next opportunities. And that's come through quite strongly with some of the work through this whole project. And you know, it can still be achievable. So yeah, look, thanks, you know, thanks so much for coming on today, Anna, and sharing, you know, some of those top tips and you know, some of the you know, making sure we steer clear of some of those potholes in the road with making sure we do our numbers and talking to the right people. So we do really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts there.
Oh no, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and look, this online session can be found on the website and on YouTube. It has been recorded. So to all our listeners out there, you know, thanks a lot for tuning in. We hope you've got something out of the last sort of 40 minutes. As Anna said, we could go on for hours about some of this stuff, but yeah, you'll be able to hopefully get the wheels moving and start thinking about sort of some of the next steps if you're on that pathway to farm ownership. So thanks for listening. Tune in next time for the next Smash online event. So thank you.
Cool, thank you.